Anita set her fork down carefully and smiled, almost as if she'd misheard. "So, when will you transfer the deposit back?" she asked. "My solicitor needs it tomorrow morning so we can complete the purchase." Her mother didn't even hesitate. "We gave your house deposit to your brother." The words landed with startling calm. "He needed it more." Silence swallowed the dining room. Across the table, Anita stared at her mother, waiting for the punchline that never came. Her father nodded, as though confirming something perfectly reasonable. "It was the right decision," Gerald said. "You have a stable career. You can save again. Your brother has 2 children. He needed the bigger house." Her younger brother, Kyle, leaned back in his chair with the comfortable confidence of someone who had already accepted victory. "I told Mom she'd understand," he said with a shrug. "You've always been good at starting over." No one apologized. No one even looked guilty. Instead, they all looked at Anita, expecting the same reaction they had seen her give her entire life. One quiet sigh, one reluctant smile, one sacrifice wrapped in the words, "It's okay." Her hands tightened beneath the table. 8 years. 8 years of skipped holidays, overtime weekends, worn-out phones, second-hand furniture, and saying no to vacations. Every dollar in that deposit had come from her. Not one penny from anyone sitting around this table. She could hear her heartbeat. Still, she didn't argue. That surprised everyone. Kyle's smile faltered first. Diane frowned. "Aren't you going to say something?" Anita slowly turned her head toward the man sitting beside her. Her fiancé, Ethan. Until that moment, he'd remained unusually quiet. Her parents had always assumed he was simply another corporate employee with a comfortable salary. They liked him well enough, mostly because they believed he would eventually make Anita's life easier and make it less likely she'd ask them for anything. Diane forced a smile. "Ethan, I'm sure you understand. Families help the child who needs it most." Gerald added, "Besides, you two will recover. You're young." Kyle chuckled. "You'll probably have another deposit saved before the year ends." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he calmly pushed his chair back. The scraping sound across the hardwood floor silenced the room. He stood, reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, unlocked it without saying a word. Everyone watched him, expecting him to open a banking app, or perhaps offer to replace the money himself. Instead, he looked directly at Diane. Then at Gerald. Finally, at Kyle. His voice was calm enough to make the room feel colder. "Should I tell all of you what I actually do for a living?" Kyle's confident grin disappeared so quickly it almost looked painful. Something in Ethan's tone had changed. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It sounded professional. Without waiting for an answer, Ethan began opening several folders on his phone. One after another. His thumb moved with practiced precision. Diane shifted uneasily. "What exactly are you doing?" Ethan didn't look up. He opened another file. Then another. Finally, he lifted his eyes and spoke quietly. Before anyone says another word. He rested his thumb above the screen. "I'd think very carefully." No one moved. The only sound in the dining room was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Diane folded her arms. "I don't appreciate being threatened in my own home." Ethan slipped the phone back down to the table instead of putting it away. "I'm not threatening anyone," he replied evenly. "I'm asking everyone here to be honest before this becomes much harder to fix." Kyle forced a laugh. "Seriously, you're acting like Mom and Dad robbed a bank." "They didn't rob a bank," Ethan answered. He looked directly at Anita. "They made a decision about money that wasn't theirs." The room fell silent again. Anita swallowed hard. As she looked from one face to another, old memories surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. When Kyle crashed his car in college after missing 3 loan payments, Her parents called relatives asking everyone to help him get back on his feet. When Anita earned a promotion after months of 12-hour workdays, Diane smiled politely before saying, "Well, it's easier to focus on work when you don't have children." When Kyle borrowed money and never repaid it, Gerald always said, "He's still figuring life out." When Anita carefully planned every expense, they laughed. "You're too serious." Back then, she'd convinced herself it wasn't favoritism. Tonight, she wasn't so sure anymore. Diane reached for her wine glass. "We're talking about family," she said. "Families don't keep score." Anita finally spoke. "I wasn't keeping score." She paused. "I was saving. 8 years." She remembered declining destination weddings because flights were too expensive. She remembered driving the same aging hatchback while coworkers upgraded to new SUVs. She remembered packing lunch every day instead of eating out. Every sacrifice had a purpose. Every dollar had a destination. Her first home. Gerald leaned forward. "We didn't waste your money. It helped your brother." Kyle nodded enthusiastically. "I've got Emma and the kids to think about." "And I don't," Anita asked quietly. "You'll have your chance," Diane replied. "You always land on your feet." Those words stung more than the confession itself. Her success had somehow become permission to take from her. Ethan finally looked toward Anita. "When did you first ask for the transfer confirmation?" She frowned. "About 3 weeks ago." "And what happened?" "My mom said the bank was running behind." Diane immediately interrupted. "They were." Ethan ignored her. "And the second time?" Anita thought back. "Dad said the account manager was on leave." Gerald shifted in his chair. "It was a busy week." "And the third time?" Ethan asked. Anita's voice grew quieter. "Mom said there'd been a paperwork delay." Ethan nodded once. Different explanation every time. No one answered. A memory clicked into place. 2 weeks earlier, she'd called Ethan during lunch. "They still haven't sent the confirmation," she'd told him. "Ask for the transfer receipt," he'd suggested. "I'm sure it's fine." "Ask anyway." She had. Her parents had promised to send it later. They never did. At the time, she'd assumed they were busy. Now another possibility settled over her. The money hadn't been waiting to be transferred. It had already been gone. Kyle suddenly sat upright. "Look, I didn't ask where every dollar came from." "No," Ethan asked. Kyle hesitated. "I mean, Mom and Dad said they wanted to help." "So you never asked whether Anita agreed?" Kyle looked toward his parents instead of answering. That silence said enough. Diane's patience finally snapped. "I am their mother." She pointed toward Anita. "I carried her for 9 months. If I decide one child needs help more than another, that's my decision." "No," Anita said. Everyone looked at her. For the first time that evening, her voice didn't shake. "It wasn't." Diane blinked. "The money wasn't yours to decide about." Gerald tried softening the moment. "You'll understand when you have children." Anita slowly shook her head. "I hope I never understand choosing one child by taking from another." The sentence hung in the room. Even Kyle looked away. She drew one slow breath before asking the question that had been growing heavier with every passing minute. "Did any of you ever intend to tell me before my closing date?" No one spoke. Her father stared at the table. Her mother looked toward the window. Kyle suddenly found the label on his water bottle fascinating. The silence became its own answer. Anita closed her eyes for a brief second. This hadn't happened today. It had been planned. And everyone at this table had expected her to discover it only after her dream home slipped away. She opened her eyes and turned toward Ethan. One thought refused to leave her mind. If he'd already organized files? If he'd already warned her, why had Ethan prepared documents before tonight? Before anyone could respond, Ethan picked up the small remote lying beside the television in the family room. He walked calmly toward the screen. "What are you doing?" Diane demanded as she hurried after him. "I'm making sure everyone is looking at the same facts. You don't have permission to use our television." Ethan didn't answer. A second later, the television came to life. His phone connected wirelessly. Kyle stood up so quickly his chair tipped backward. "Turn that off." Ethan remained composed. "No." The first image appeared. A simple spreadsheet. Month after month. Year after year. Every transfer Anita had made into the savings account. January. February. March. Thousands of small deposits. Overtime bonuses. Tax refunds. Annual raises. Each line carried only one name beside the transaction. Anita Brooks. No one else had deposited a single dollar. Kyle frowned. "I've never seen that." "You weren't supposed to," Ethan replied. Another screen appeared. The total savings climbed steadily until it reached the exact amount Anita needed for her house deposit. The room became noticeably quieter. Diane folded her arms. "Saving the money doesn't change the fact that we're family." Ethan tapped the screen again. "It changes ownership." The next display appeared. A series of text messages. The first one was from Diane. "Your deposit is completely safe with us." Another. "Don't worry, every dollar is still yours." Another. "We'll transfer your money before closing." Another. "Your house fund hasn't gone anywhere." Each message carried a date. Each one was unmistakably from Diane's phone. Anita stared at the television. She had forgotten half of those conversations. Now they were impossible to ignore. Gerald cleared his throat. "We never denied the money belonged to her." "No," Ethan answered. "You acknowledged it repeatedly." He pressed the screen again. A bank record appeared. Transfer completed. Date. Amount. Recipient account. Kyle Brooks. Transfer completed 6 days earlier. 6 days before Anita's scheduled closing. The room froze. Kyle's wife, Emma, looked sharply at him. "You told me your parents were helping us with their savings." Kyle swallowed. "They said they wanted to." Emma's expression changed. "You never said it was Anita's deposit." Kyle couldn't answer. An elderly aunt, sitting quietly near the end of the table, finally spoke. Why wasn't Anita asked? No one answered her. She looked at Diane instead. "You told all of us she was buying her first home." Diane's confidence began slipping. "We knew she'd recover." "That wasn't my question." The aunt folded her hands. "Why didn't you ask her?" Again. Silence. Kyle suddenly stepped forward. "I honestly thought it was a gift." Ethan looked at him. "A gift?" Kyle nodded quickly. "Mom said they wanted to help." Gerald interrupted. "Well, we never exactly called it a gift." Diane spun toward him. "Gerald, you said we'd explain later." "No, I said we'd explain after." She stopped herself. Too late. Everyone in the room had heard it. The explanations were no longer matching. Diane slammed her hand onto the dining table. "After everything we've sacrificed for this family, this is the thanks we get." Her voice cracked with anger. "We raised Anita. We supported her. We deserve a little gratitude." Anita spoke quietly. "You weren't giving me something." She looked directly at her mother. "You were taking something." No one challenged her. Ethan touched the screen one final time. The television returned to a single image. A folder labeled Communications Archive. He looked around the room. Those messages create obligations you clearly don't understand. Kyle frowned. What does that even mean? Gerald stared uneasily at Ethan. You're some kind of investment banker, aren't you? Diane nodded quickly. I knew it. You're trying to scare us because you've got money. Ethan didn't correct them. He simply watched. For the first time that evening, Kyle looked genuinely afraid. Not because of wealth. Because Ethan wasn't acting like someone trying to intimidate them. He was acting like someone documenting them. Without another word, Ethan tapped one final button. A soft tone echoed from his phone. He slipped it back into his pocket. The timestamped backup has now been sent. The color drained from Kyle's face. The timestamped backup has now been sent. The words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Gerald was the first to break the silence. Sent to who? Ethan slipped his phone into his jacket. I'd rather not answer that. You can't just walk into our home and start sending private information around, Gerald snapped. I didn't send private information, Ethan replied evenly. I secured evidence. Diane's face paled. What evidence? The evidence all of you have been creating yourselves. Anita's phone vibrated on the dining table. She glanced down. A notification from her bank had arrived. Additional account documentation successfully received. She looked at Ethan. You already arranged this. I arranged for your records to be protected, he answered. I couldn't arrange anything else without your permission. For the first time all evening, Anita realized he hadn't been preparing to attack her family. He'd been preparing to protect her. Kyle suddenly pushed both hands through his hair. This has gone way too far. No, Ethan said calmly. It started going too far when Anita's money stopped being Anita's. Kyle looked toward his parents. We have to tell them. Gerald's expression tightened. Tell them what? Kyle hesitated. Then he whispered. I already paid the builder. The room fell silent again. Emma turned toward her husband. You what? I paid the non-refundable reservation. Using Anita's deposit. Kyle couldn't meet her eyes. I thought everything was settled. Emma took a slow step backward, as if she no longer recognized the man beside her. Anita stared at her brother. So even if you wanted to give it back? Kyle closed his eyes. I can't. It isn't sitting in an account anymore. It's gone. The weight of those words hit everyone differently. For Anita, it meant her dream home was suddenly tangled in someone else's purchase. For Gerald, it meant this wasn't simply a family disagreement anymore. For Diane, it meant there was no easy way to pretend nothing had happened. Gerald rounded on Kyle. You should have waited. Kyle looked stunned. You told me to move quickly before the seller found another buyer. I said be careful. You said Anita would understand. I never said spend everything immediately. Diane pointed at Gerald. This is your fault. My fault. You're the one who kept saying we'd explain after the closing. Kyle stared between them. Both of you told me not to worry. Within seconds, the united front that had existed all evening completely collapsed. Instead of defending one another, they began defending themselves. Ethan remained where he was. Calm. Patient. Watching. I started becoming concerned 3 weeks ago, he said. Everyone stopped arguing. The explanations kept changing. He looked at Anita. The first time you asked about your transfer, they blamed the bank. She nodded. The second time, they blamed an account manager. Another nod. The third time, there was suddenly paperwork. He looked back at Diane and Gerald. People who tell the truth rarely need a different explanation every week. Neither parent spoke. Anita turned toward Ethan. You knew. I suspected. And that's why you kept asking me to save every message. Yes. I didn't understand why. I hoped I'd be wrong. His voice softened for the first time that evening. I would have preferred looking foolish over seeing you betrayed. Anita felt something shift inside her. Her entire life, people had asked her to be accommodating, to be patient, to sacrifice. This was the first person who had quietly prepared to defend her instead. Diane's composure finally cracked. Tears filled her eyes. Ethan, please. Her voice was almost pleading now. We don't need outsiders involved. We can fix this as a family. Ethan shook his head. That depends on Anita. He looked toward her. You still have one opportunity to resolve this honestly. No threats. No raised voice. Just a choice. Every eye in the room turned toward Anita. The same daughter who had always been expected to keep the peace now held all the leverage. She drew a slow breath. Before she could answer, Ethan stepped forward. He straightened his jacket. Then, for the first time since anyone had met him, he introduced himself by his full professional title. My name is Ethan Walker, he said. I'm a specialist financial crimes attorney. The room fell completely silent. Even Kyle stopped breathing for a moment. Ethan met each person's eyes before continuing. For the past 9 years, I've represented victims of unauthorized transfers, fiduciary abuse, and financial exploitation. Diane stared at him. You're a lawyer. A financial crimes attorney. Gerald tried to laugh, but the sound died almost immediately. This is ridiculous. No, Ethan replied. It's serious. He turned toward Anita. I didn't tell your family what I do because I wanted them to know me as your fiancé, not as someone whose profession might make every conversation defensive. He looked back at Diane. But after hearing 3 different explanations for why Anita couldn't access her own savings, I became concerned. Diane's voice trembled. We're her parents. I know, Ethan answered. And that makes what happened even more significant. He tapped the folder still open on the television. These messages matter. He pointed to one. Your deposit is completely safe with us. Another. We'll transfer your money before closing. Another. Every dollar is still yours. You acknowledged repeatedly, in writing, that this money belonged exclusively to Anita. Gerald swallowed. We were only holding it. Exactly. Ethan's answer was immediate. You admitted that yourselves. The realization slowly spread across Gerald's face. The words they had casually sent over months had become evidence. Diane reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. We never meant. She stopped. There wasn't a sentence she could finish without admitting something worse. Kyle looked between his parents. So, he spoke quietly. This isn't just a family disagreement. Ethan shook his head. No. It's a documented transfer of someone else's funds after repeatedly confirming those funds belonged to her. No one argued. No one could. Emma finally broke the silence. She looked directly at Kyle. You told me your parents were helping us. They were trying to. Not with their money. Kyle lowered his head. I know. Emma stepped away from him. I would have rather stayed in our apartment another 5 years than buy a home with your sister's future. Kyle covered his face with both hands. I thought. You didn't think. Emma's voice cracked. You trusted what was convenient. Diane suddenly turned toward Anita. Honey. Her voice sounded smaller than Anita had ever heard it. We'll fix this. We'll work something out. Anita remained quiet. For years, she would have rushed to comfort her mother. Tonight, she simply listened. Gerald spoke next. We'll sell some investments. We'll borrow if we have to. We'll repay every cent. Ethan nodded. That would be the appropriate place to start. The weeks that followed were nothing like the family had imagined. Rather than facing years of litigation, Diane and Gerald agreed to mediation. The written messages, bank records, and their own admissions during dinner left little room for dispute. The settlement required them to return Anita's entire house deposit. They also reimbursed the additional legal expenses, interest, and financial losses caused by delaying her purchase. Kyle's home purchase collapsed almost immediately. Without Anita's money, the builder canceled the contract after the payment dispute. He lost the reservation fee he had already paid. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to face the consequences of his own financial decisions instead of expecting someone else to absorb them. News traveled quickly through the extended family. Relatives who had always assumed Anita exaggerated the favoritism began calling her. Several apologized. Her aunt admitted quietly, "I wish I'd asked more questions years ago." Some family members distanced themselves from Diane and Gerald, disturbed by how casually they had sacrificed one child's future for another. Holiday gatherings became much smaller. No one openly defended what had happened anymore. One afternoon, several months later, Anita stood in the doorway of a newly built home. The closing documents rested neatly on the kitchen island. She smiled as the realtor handed over the keys. "This one's yours." She looked at Ethan. "We actually did it." He smiled back. "You did." She laughed softly. "I almost forgot that." "No." He gently squeezed her hand. "You spent 8 years earning this. You simply stopped letting other people spend it for you." Moving day felt strangely peaceful. There were no dramatic speeches. No surprise visits. Only boxes. Fresh paint. Sunlight through the living room windows. Friends who genuinely wanted to celebrate her success. Every room reminded Anita that she had finally built something nobody else could claim. Months later, her phone buzzed while she was planting flowers near the front porch. A message from Diane appeared. "Can we please put everything behind us?" Anita read it twice. Then she typed her reply. "I hope one day we can have a healthier relationship, but my finances, my decisions, and my future will never belong to anyone else again." She pressed send. There was no anger in her voice anymore. Only certainty. That evening, she stepped inside her home and locked the front door. She looked around the quiet living room. The walls. The windows. The keys resting in her hand. For years, she'd believed buying a house was her biggest dream. Now she understood something far more valuable. The greatest thing she had finally claimed wasn't the home. It was the freedom to stop paying for everyone else's choices.